So before we get into working with oracle cards, I wanted to share with you my top 5 decks, top 5 oracle decks of all time at this point. I'm always discovering new decks, and I've also recently purchased a new oracle deck that I have a feeling will be on this list, but I haven't got to spend enough time with it yet to be sure about that. So these are my top 5 decks, and these are the decks that I'm going to be referencing as we talk about working with oracle cards in our own practice. So the first deck that I'm going to talk about is the first deck that I ever purchased. I recently did a review of it, and it is Brian Froud's and Wendy Froud's Heart of Fairies Oracle deck. This deck is very dear to my heart, and for a lot of reasons. It started my journey with the cards in this life, and it's also a deck that gives me some really straight and fair and honest answers, but that I still feel really close to. So this deck would be number 1 on my list. Then I really deeply love working with this next deck, and that is the Oracle of the Dragon Fae by Lucy Cavendish. I'm just on top of that. This is what the backing of the cards looks like. And there's one of the cards. I obviously, as you can tell, 4 of these 5 decks are fairy decks. So I align really closely energetically with fairies, and I feel like I work with them a lot in their energies. So these are the decks that are the closest to home for me. And the Oracle of the Dragon Fae by Lucy Cavendish is second on my list of top 5. After that is another Brian Froud deck, the Fairies Oracle by Brian Froud. This is the backing of this deck. And here's an example of some of the illustrations to be found in the deck. This deck isn't quite as maybe loving energetically as the Heart of Fairies Oracle, in my opinion. However, this deck is filled with, and I feel like, real fairies, and they give me very honest messages, and they give others very honest messages. And again, they're not always messages that we want to hear, but they're necessary to be heard. And a lot of insight from this deck. I do a lot of meditative work with this deck. So this is the Fairies Oracle by Brian Froud and Jessica Macbeth. After that, my 4th deck is going to be the Enchanted Map Oracle deck by Colette Baron Reid. This is the backing. Here's an example of the artwork that you can find within this deck. I really love the use of imagery in this deck, and I really like a lot of Colette Baron Reid's philosophy, and I enjoy the meanings that are attached to these cards, and also developing my own meanings with these cards. This is a deck that I purchased when my collection wasn't that big, and I was really excited to work with this deck because it's another deck that I felt really connected with, and have been able to offer really insightful readings for others with this deck as well. In fact, I have a family member that this deck really loves to work with, and it always cracks me up. So the Enchanted Map Oracle deck by Colette Baron Reid is 4th on my list. And finally, 5th on my list is the Oracle of Shadows and Light by Lucy Cavendish and Jasmine Beckett Griffith. This is the American edition, so this is the backing. Here's an example of the artwork. So even though this deck was geared toward teens in the States, I really love this deck, and reading the book really brought me closer to the information in this deck and the fairies within this deck and understanding it, and I love working with it. And I really love the fact that the messages are given in a very gentle way, but they're no less effective and they're no less important. So this is the 5th deck on my list of Oracle decks, all-time favorites, as of this date, August 29th. So, so I'm going to be referencing these decks a lot in the upcoming videos where we talk about